Welcome to Ask Sean, where I explore all sorts of questions about life, relationships, and being human. I'm Sean Slevin, a licensed professional counselor and a licensed marriage and family therapist. And if you have a question that you'd like to ask me anonymously, you can do so at www.asksean.org. So today is going to be a bit different of a video. This is actually a kind of talk / conversation that I had at a gathering, a conference of sorts, that was about Christianity and the arts. So it was a Christian context. I come from a kind of a Christian perspective, so I was kind of talking with folks about. I was one of many speakers that were exploring Christianity and the arts, and in particular, kind of where kind of my talk went is. It's really exploring the brokenness in Christian culture around the idea of self-denial. There's just a lot of crap. And that intersects with the arts and how Protestantism in particular has kind of had a really unhealthy relationship, often an antagonistic relationship with the arts. Because of this warped idea of self-denial that really kind of is more about in a desire to be what folks think is being faithful to God. There can be this idea that we're supposed to hate ourselves, which is just false, and I don't think is what God wants of us. And if that's what a belief system is really about, well, get out, right? That's not good. But I guess I do want to say here for a moment, spirituality and religion and Christianity in particular can be really charged, I've got my own wounding around Christianity and religion, ways that I've been hurt. And I know many, many, many folks in our culture and Western culture have been really, really wounded by folks who claim to be Christian, been really hurt by churches, by pastors, by fellow attendees. So I guess I just want to give an acknowledgement of that. This talk and kind of where I go in it, this is not about trying to convert anybody, or be mean to anyone. If anything, it's really trying to kind of offer some corrective. If you're a Christian, I think there can be some really good challenging things and hopefully some healing here. If you're not coming from a Christian context, I have, just as with my client load, which is, all sorts of people, have Christians and agnostics and atheists and people of other faith backgrounds, who I work with as clients, and certainly, here on YouTube, which is even broader, can be folks coming from all sorts of corners of life. You don't need to be a Christian for there to be, I think, some things of value in this video. I think that, the kind of the themes that I'm exploring around, what does a healthy self-denial look like, which I admit, is a little bit provocative language, right? Just even the phrase self-denial, it's almost hard to imagine, that should automatically be bad, right? And so I guess kind of really wanting to, reframe that, because the reality is all of us do have ways that we long for, both in terms of our own character development and those around us, that there would be a healthy self-denial. You think about a parent, right? Part of trying to parent well is there's a lot of self-denial that has to happen there. Now, the question is, what's the difference between doing that in an unhealthy way versus a healthy way? And there is a difference, and it matters. It matters both for the parent, but it matters also for the child. Now, I don't talk specifically about parenting in this subsequent video here, but the principles of what I am getting at very much apply to that, and really I would say all walks of life. So yeah, I hope that this will be helpful to everyone, from all contexts. But yeah, I again want to acknowledge, like, many of you that are watching this, like, you may have a lot of pain and a lot of hurt from so-called Christianity, and churches and whatnot, or other religious contexts. And I can't begin to know all the particulars, right, of each of your stories, or to even try to do justice to speaking to that. But I just want to acknowledge that I know there's a lot of hard stuff there, and I'm so sorry. And I hope that, if you decide to, watch the rest of this video, I hope that how you experience me and my heart, and kind of the ways that I experience my faith, I hope that can maybe offer some healing, not in terms of persuading you towards anything, but just in terms of, like, that, that there can be, that faith can be lived out in a way that is kind, and that is desiring for our healing, as opposed to being, cruel, for being frank, which is kind of often what, religion of various contexts can become, but I don't think has to become. So yeah, I hope that wherever you're coming from, I hope that there can be some things in this that, that can be really helpful to you.
I'm going to have Sean Slevin come up here. Give it up for Sean.
Hello.
Hey, Sean.
Hey, man.
You guys, Sean is somebody that I'm getting to know better, and he comes from Virginia to come and hang out with us at our well gatherings. He travels like 2 hours to come hang out with us. So gracious of him. And the more I get to know Sean, the more I'm like, I really love this guy's heart, and I want to know more about him. So we're going to talk with Sean here a few minutes, but I want to read a little bit of a bio about Sean real quick. Sean has been counseling at Transition Counseling, which is his own private counseling practice, in Harrisonburg, Virginia, for 14 years, creatively guiding others in becoming more human. He's been pondering the process of growth and healing his whole adult life. His resonant poetry often explores intersections of lament, hope, and joy, and sometimes simple delights like a firefly lighting up in his beard. I love it.
True story.
Sean's comfortable with mystery, yet endlessly curious and an avid learner. Sean has a gift for making connections and reflecting thoughtfully across disciplines, which he uses both to understand himself and people from all walks of life. Whether on horseback or falling hard at a skate park, he finds meaning, beauty, and growth opportunities in each of life's moments. Sean is a counselor, and he's also a poet. And Sean, thank you so much for being here, man.
Thanks for having me, man.
If you check out Sean's Instagram, is so interesting because you'll see him doing crazy stuff like all the time. He was sled riding this past winter in one of his posts. He does horseback riding and like stuff with the horses, and what else? Skate parks and just all kinds of stuff.
Lots of adventures.
Lots of adventures. So Sean and I have kind of a pointed topic that we want to talk about, but I also really want Sean just to tell us a little bit about your practice as a counselor, maybe how you started off doing that, and even talk a little bit about your poetic work, like your poetry, maybe even how those two things connect.
Yeah, gosh. Thinking about how I got started. Yeah, some of that's probably too long of a story for for this moment. But I guess what I would say is that I am a counselor because of the kind of person that I am, because of how God has made me. And so it eventually made sense to explore what kind of vocation could I inhabit that would allow for kind of the kind of expression of the kind of person that I am and the kind of places that I'm drawn to. I was often finding myself going places in conversation with people where they would eventually say, "I've never told anyone this, but," and then some things would spill out, and then usually some tears, and so eventually it was like, maybe I should get some training and actually do this officially, and not have to carry around boxes of tissues with me everywhere, maybe. So yeah, much longer story in terms of lots of twists and turns, and as far as that, I think I'm kind of, as my bio said. I mean, I'm very interested in. Interested is even an inadequate word. I'm always trying to understand, what does it mean to be human? Like, what is God inviting us to grow into, for me to grow into as a person, but for all of us, trying to make sense of like what are we aiming for? Because surely it's got to be more than just keeping up with my favorite TV shows or whatever. And there's TV shows are fine and whatnot, but so I think both my counseling and my poetry are both revolve around that kind of that kind of core question. My poetry tends to kind of come out of, I'll be trying to think through something, and I'll start to realize, oh, this is a poem that's starting to be born. Let me start to actually write this down. So there's something about how God has built my mind that kind of I think of, for much of my life, have thought poetically, though I don't have a huge body of poetry actually recorded. But yeah, there's just something about the rhythm of poetry that, seems to be built into me a little bit. And there's a poetry to lives. Even though every person I work with is unique, there are all these kind of shared experiences. We all have experienced fear. We've all experienced shame. We all have trauma in some way or another, whether we are conscious of it or not. And so I'm drawn to kind of being with those sort of repeated patterns, but also in this way of like getting to discover what's particular about this moment, about this person's life, this person's experience, this bit of joy, this bit of sorrow. Even though it is in the pattern of so many other joys and sorrows, it's also this specific moments, particularness. So yeah, that's maybe a little bit of thoughts and response.
No, I think that's great. Yeah, that's great. I want to ask you, earlier than I've asked other people, what you consider to be sacred about what you do, about your work.
Yeah, I love this question. I think some of what I would share ties in and builds on kind of some of the themes that have been expressed. I think about presence, so and I think this would be true of my poetry as well, but thinking particularly about counseling, the counseling work that I do, and the counseling that I receive, because I receive a lot of counseling. I've been a client in counseling for longer than I've been a counselor, which I could go on a very long rabbit trail about why I think that is important for counselors. But yeah, I'm seeking to be like the one who made us, who is able to be present to everything. God is present to the most breathtaking beauties and joys of this universe he's made, and to its most terrifying horrors. And he's able to be present to that whole range and stay himself. He never falls into despair. He never just kind of loses his shit and flies into a rage or whatever. Like he's always grounded. He's always himself, and he never falls into worshiping something that isn't meant to be worshipped, but just to be enjoyed, right? In terms of beauty, and he never is tempted to think that some moment of joy should somehow be made into more than just that moment. Which we would certainly, as American culture is very much about that. How can we, make life about one little sliver of it, and let's delete all the rest, which would make for a very dull painting and very boring poetry. I'm trying to be, I guess in terms of thinking about the sacredness of my work, I'm trying to be present to whatever people are bringing into the room. And so part of what that means is I have to be practicing being present to whatever I'm bringing into the room. This is why I have had so much counseling as a client, because I got a lot of junk inside of me. I've got my own wounded children, I've got my own traumas, I've got my own stuff that is in process, and will be, until I go home. And so I think it's, my calling as a human being is to be present, to keep growing and being present and finding all the parts of me that I've forgotten about or didn't know about or have abandoned or locked away, that have been terrified of. And so it's that practice then that then sets the stage for, as I work with clients, or as I'm writing a poem, trying to be hospitable, to sort of set the table for, whatever, beauty or horror needs to be met, needs to be known. And so I guess the thing that I would say about all that to kind of apply more broadly is, I think this calling of presence, and this, I think it's not an accident that this is a theme that keeps showing up, that, we're here at something, at an event called LOOM, which is another way of thinking about presence. God's presence over the chaos, his presence in the chaos, and how he draws forth out of that, invites out of that, a beautiful order and vitality. And so I think in whatever our context in life, like this is what we're called to, and whatever our words and form of this are to grow into, is to little by little increase our capacity to be present to whatever it is inside of us and around us that is needing to be met. So I don't think that's just the domain of the counselor or the domain of the artist, but in many ways the calling of us as humans. And so I have, my particulars, right, of that in terms of my vocations, but yeah, I think this is kind of the sacredness of what we all bring.
That's great. Really good. So here, we're just going to dive into this. One of the things that I struggled with when I was called back to creativity after going to Bible school to be a pastor and growing up in the church has been voiced by a lot of the people in the creative communities that we're a part of. Conversations that we're in, sometimes a very pointed question, and sometimes it hovers in the background as like this thing that's pushing in on artists, and that is, it's probably just best to say it this way, that we know, I heard recently an artist in a church, their pastor came to them and said, artists can't really be Christians, and Christians can't really be artists, or there's always going to be a significant problem there, because art is always about self-expression and Christianity is about self-denial. And when I was called back to creativity in my own life, this was something I struggled with desperately. So much of the Christian culture is geared in this direction. Like, we have mantras, we have axioms that we hold on to that express this idea. Pulled out of context, we say things like, more of you and less of me. Or you must increase and I've got to decrease, you know? John the Baptist says that, but he's saying it in a very specific context, right? What do we do with that? Is that even a reasonable dichotomy to draw? Like, you want to just dive into that for a second?
Yes.
Great.
Many seconds.
Yes.
Y'all didn't really want to go to lunch. So, we've had a prior conversation about this, so it's been bouncing around in my mind. And I was laying in bed last night, having trouble sleeping, which is not an unusual thing for me. And I was reflecting on how some of the things that have been bubbling up have had a bit of an edge to them. And as I just began to be a little present to that, I was like, oh, right, well, because I've been hurt by these kinds of ideas. I think many of us have. And so it would be easy, and a part of me would honestly really like to just like kind of pounce on this real hard and, kind of be kind of mean to, this pastor whom, I don't know, but is a fellow human. But I want to, I guess, acknowledge that like this kind of dichotomy can be a place of pain. And one of the ways that we struggle to be present with pain is we get angry. Now, anger, I think, just as a very brief aside, I think anger is actually a really important emotion, but it's such a important emotion, such a powerful emotion that it actually takes an immense amount of characterological strength to inhabit it healthily. And so most of us, our relationship with anger is rather poor. Either we spend a lot of energy suppressing it because we're afraid of it, or we have a lot of experiences of kind of giving ourselves over to it and seeing the ways in which that's destructive. And I've done both, and that if we had more time, that would make for some interesting stories. But so I think anger is really important. I want to name that. I think it's actually like the redemption of the world actually is dependent on our learning to have a healthy relationship with anger, and that would definitely be a talk all to itself. But our typical use of anger is to avoid our pain, to avoid the sadness that's underneath the surface. So this pastor, he's trying to do the right thing. He's been living in this dichotomy, and he thinks this is how the world is, and he's trying to advise someone as best he can. Even if it, on the surface seems a bit jerky, and kind of is a little jerky maybe, but I'm hearing this third, fourth hand, but I want to give a little grace, right? Like that this is, so many of the jerky things in the world that we all do or suffer are really just, we're all just trying to figure out how to do life, as best we can, out of the junk that we've been born into, that we've been living in, and the time in history we've been born into. So having said all that, I do think that this is a false dichotomy. I think that, and maybe I'll kind of lay out sort of my premise a little bit here on the front end, and then try to unpack it, with as much time as I think your energy will allow. So I think that there's healthy and unhealthy forms of self-denial, and there's healthy and unhealthy forms of self-expression. I think that a healthy form, and thus a godly form of self-denial, is actually going to be intertwined with a healthy form, or I would say a godly form of self-expression. I think these feed each other in a very reciprocal kind of way. So having said that, let's kind of maybe unpack a little kind of what I mean. So I'm actually going to start with the self-denial piece just because that's what makes sense to my brain. On a different day, I would maybe go a different direction. But I keep coming back to, as I've been pondering this, in Hebrews, where the writer invites us to fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy set before him, endures the cross, despising the shame. So we often, when I'm trying to make sense of what does a healthy pattern look like, I'm looking at Scripture characterologically. I'm looking both at specific depictions of God, but also just the overall arc of Scripture. And so, it's not a bad thing to be like, okay, I'm trying to figure out how to be human. What does healthy self-denial look like? Oh, right, God came and died, rose again. There's probably some kind of self-denial going on there. What can this teach us about what God is inviting us into? And so I think that this little passage is so fascinating, and it would be interesting to do a whole sermon series probably on just that chapter, because it's all about kind of cultivating character that this verse is in the context of. And so there is this joy that Jesus is motivated by, and I would suggest that even though the word is not used, that there's a love that is driving him, that is driving this radical act of self-denial. And I want to suggest, and I'm opening up something that I don't know if I totally have time to really do justice to, but I would suggest that it's a love not just of us, though certainly that, and certainly a love of creation, but it's also a love of himself. God is thoroughly in love with, and at love with, maybe if I could say that, with himself. And it's out of that he is motivated to step into our lives and to invite us up into that. And so this is not a narcissistic love. Just a little brief aside, like a narcissism, in terms of like a narcissistic self-love, isn't love at all. Like somebody who's narcissistic actually hates themselves. That's why they have to be so jerky, why they have to put others down, because they feel so incredibly small. Which, that's just a useful principle in general. Like if somebody's being mean or cruel, like that tells you something about how they feel about themselves. Now they're probably not able to be conscious of that, right? Because that in of itself would be too painful. But anyways, that's just a useful aside that can help us see people as human beings and not just as monsters that we can all sometimes masquerade as. So Christ is engaged in this radical thing, right? Like, we see him wrestling in the Garden of Gethsemane, you know what I'm talking about, that garden. and having this candid conversation with the Father of like, if there's another way, and it's such an interesting rhetorical kind of conversation, because the Father and the Son and the Spirit have planned this all along. Like, this is how we're going to redeem the world. I'm going to come, I'm going to live among them, I'm going to die, and I'm going to rise again, both to save them from their sins, but also to show them that it can be done, that there's a different way of life, that the self-protection and the hatred of self and others actually isn't the way. That this like radical vulnerability, this vulnerability unto death, this love of others and love of self is actually the way to live. So there's a ton more that I would love to say about that, but I'm trying to. There's other things I don't want to have time to get to. So I'm trying to make a case there that Jesus is his love for others and his love for himself is kind of what is part of what roots this capacity for self-denial. I guess the other thing I want to throw in there too is in terms of a category of healthy self-denial is that you have to have a self. So here's where I want to kind of call out some of the ways that many of us have been wounded. We can have this idea in Christian culture that self-denial is not knowing yourself, not having boundaries, kind of just, taking whatever comes and, trying to slap some Bible verses and Jesus' name on it and, trying to be happy or whatever. And that doesn't fit, if the things that I've been saying are true, that's not being present to everything that is in one's life, right? That's not, I mean, we don't see that modeled in that garden that I can't pronounce the name of. Jesus is wrestling, he's sweating blood, which is, I think there's been whatever, you can probably look up, like, what's the physiology of that? How the heck does that work? But, it's this intense struggle, right? For something that he has chosen to do, that he chose before any of us were born, before the foundations of the world, that, like, I'm going to go and endure the pinnacle of human torture at that point in history. And I'm going to die, and I'm going to come back from the dead. And he's engaged in this wrestling around that. He's feeling, I think the wrestling is really, it's not that he's like having doubts, it's that he is present to the horror that is coming. This isn't this, and so somehow in the midst of being present to that horror, there is also this anticipated joy of, like, I'm gonna deal this final blow to death. I'm gonna show the world that death isn't as big as we all think it is. That physical death and all the symbolic deaths, the thousands of symbolic deaths, that we all go through over the course of human lives, and then the final insult of the last death, like, that it's not as big as we think. That there's a whole nother way of being that trumps all of this. And so, like, Jesus has to be thoroughly himself. He has to be so solidly himself. He says elsewhere, like, no one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord. So all of these things, I'm trying to, sort of quickly make a case for that to actually engage in healthy self-denial. Like, you have to know yourself. You have to be endeavoring to know yourself. You have to be endeavoring to be present to whatever's going on in your life, the good and the bad. And do I have another thought? You have to grow into a more solid human being, which, I mean, I'm finding that, like, I'm wanting to, like, just expound on that for hours. But, so let me pause there for a moment. There's more stuff that I want to tie in and talk about self-expression. But, yeah, are there things that you want to kind of ping off of with all that?
I think that's a great entry. I love the idea, and it's a new idea. It takes a lot of development, and thoughtful development around the idea of Jesus and God loving himself, and the idea of the Trinity being this thing that we're called into that's about sharing. One way that's been helpful for me to think about this conversation is, we look at self-centeredness as being a problem, but what we do as a knee-jerk reaction is we say that the opposite of that is the solution, God-centeredness. And what we usually mean by that is that God-centeredness means that we forget about ourselves, more of you and less of me, that sort of idea, where we completely forget about ourselves in order to hone our attention onto God. But the problem there is that then we eliminate ourselves from the equation. So a God-centeredness, as terrible as this is going to sound, a God-centeredness is not the solution to self-centeredness. A relational centeredness is the solution to a self-centeredness.
Well, and it's like, even if we play with the God-centeredness motif, right? It's like, well, okay, so what is God's posture towards me? Well, he came and died and rose again for me, specifically, for every part of me. And so it follows, if I'm meant to be like him, I should have that kind of relationship with myself too. Like, that's the fascinating thing, right? Like, we, Christ, you see again and again in the Gospels, like, he's inviting people to step out of their self-protection and their defensiveness. I mean, especially you see this with the Pharisees. You feel his sorrow as he's preparing to enter Jerusalem, and he's like, how I longed to gather you under my wings like a hen gathers her chicks, and you were not willing. And then I'm paraphrasing now, and now, you're going to end up desolate. Is kind of where he's alluding to how Jerusalem's going to be ransacked and whatnot in future years. And so it's like, it just doesn't follow that, like, if God loves me this much, if he loves each of us this much, that then we're supposed to hate ourselves? Like, I mean, that, how does that really work if we really stop and think about it, right? Like, and again, I think, we're skittish here, we all can have discomfort around this because we don't have a lot of experiences of like, what does like a healthy love of self look and feel like? Like there can be a lot of things that masquerade as a love of self that's really just another form of avoidance. And so I guess that's part of the thing, right? Like God is interested in shaping us and inviting us to be shaped into fuller humans, and so, again, coming back to that passage in Hebrews that is all about this sort of struggle to like, characterologically grow. And so a love of self isn't an easy life or a comfortable life, but it does lead to a fuller life, I guess I would say. Yeah, I'll pause.
No, I think that's really helpful. And I think one of the reasons why this is important to talk about is because, we may not recognize that we may not be dealing with self-hatred or something like that. But it comes up in different ways. Like we've already heard the word guilt used several times last night about entering into a creative process, something that actually gives us life. And so there's hints there about how we're actually feeling about our own feelings. And where there are truths, this conversation becomes so difficult because we're walking a very narrow path with a ditch on both sides. And the trick is when you're in one ditch and you recognize that you're in a ditch, you want to jerk the wheel and you end up in the other ditch, rather than figuring out the rhythm of staying on the narrow path. I know we're pretty short on time here. So, and I want to take a couple questions if anybody has them. But I really appreciate this, Sean. It's such a huge topic that I think we could unpack so much. But I love the idea of initiating the conversation around this in order to dive deeper into healing places within ourselves and within our communities that really need healing and really need a solid foundational structure in order to understand what it means to be a creative person, because you're going to be diving into the importance of yourself. You can't get away from that. If God cares about creativity, then he cares about the idiosyncrasies of you. And I think that that's the thing that we really want to hit home and remind ourselves of. So, any questions, thoughts on this topic? Maybe we can just take like two if there's any. Yeah. Do we have another mic? Oh, here.
Do you think that let me just phrase it this way. One of the things that God has been teaching me, and I'm not sure I've been learning well, I'm in the process of him teaching me, is sometimes self-denial, we think of self-denial looks like self-deprecation. And I think self-denial looks different based on the bent of your personality. And like for Maria, to get up there, self-denial for her might be, I've denied myself the comfort of staying off the stage.
Exactly.
And I think that sometimes, but other people looking at her might be like, oh, look at her, she needs to deny herself and get off the stage, when she really is denying herself. And so I think this becomes a really, at least for me, a very complicated, like, what does that look like? Because it's not something that someone can put on you or judge from the outside. It has to be something that is between you and God. And where am I going in this process? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I love that. Yeah, absolutely. We end up with, kind of over-applied rules because, somebody has an experience that is impactful for them, and maybe a number of people do, and then it's like, oh well, let's apply this to everyone. And so that's it's a common thing, it's an understandable thing, but we also end up hurting ourselves and each other. So a barometer that I use with myself is, actually this makes me think of some related principles maybe that I'll tie in. But I'm trying to pay attention to like what the difference in feel internally between kind of an avoidance versus a kindness, because we're all in process. We can't do everything, right? We're like in terms of whatever our growing edge is. So the related principle I want to tie in that I think can flesh this out is like when you're trying to develop a skill, when you're trying to build an emotional muscle, spiritual muscles, like you want to be working hard enough that it is uncomfortable. So in that regard, discomfort is kind of the goal. Like, so I should be a bit uncomfortable. Like if you're going to the gym and you're not uncomfortable a bit, well then you're, what are you doing? And like, it's got to be within a certain range, so using the gym analogy, which I think is really helpful, it's kind of cool. God made us embodied beings. There's all sorts of principles we can learn about life and character through the fact that we have bodies. So if we overdo it, if we go way too outside of our capacity, what's within reach, then you tear muscles, right? And then like you got to do rehab. So you want to kind of, the general principle is to be aiming in life to always be sort of in this range where it's like, it's hard enough that you're noticing it, and and you're maybe not even totally sure, am I doing things right? But it's not so crazy hard that like if I metaphorically drop the barbell, like I'm going to be in the hospital, right? Like you want to have enough internal and external support that like I'm going to make it through this. Like I'm not about to kill myself. And so then we then apply that to then all the particulars of our life, right? Where it's like you could take the same exact sort of external like behavior, and in one moment, like that could be, sort of a healthy self-denial. Like I'm leaning into being stretched, like I'm choosing to do this hard thing because I think it would be good for me, good for my character, good for sort of, the direction God's calling me in. Or you could have the same external kind of, thing. In a different moment, it's like, actually, I need to refrain from that because like that's doesn't make sense for kind of where I'm at in this moment. And the reality is we're not going to know 100% for sure. Like this is part of just, we're all kind of bumbling in the dark, asking the Spirit to guide us and trying to hear the Spirit as well as we can, being imperfect beings. So, you try things and then you listen, How does it, what does it teach me about, what would I calibrate, and adjust for next time? Because it is so particular to what's my relationship to this moment like, as far as whether like, do I need to get up on the stage and stretch myself, or no, actually I need to get off the stage because like I'm doing the stage thing as a way of avoiding something that I need to be with. So yeah, hopefully that speaks some to your question.
That's great. Any other questions for Sean?
Yeah, I got one. So we've talked about kind of a healthy self-denial and an unhealthy self-denial. How about an unhealthy self-expression as it pertains to art? Because obviously in general, we need a level of self-control with how we express ourselves. But with art, do you believe that there's an unhealthy self-expression in art? And if so, how do you tell the difference between healthy and unhealthy?
Yeah, this is a great question, and this is one I'm still thinking through, like comparatively to the self-denial piece. I'm still kind of thinking through some of this. So some of this I may kind of think through out loud right now, but in terms of my own trying to make sense of this, I start with thinking about, okay, it seems like God is self-expressive. He made this whole universe. The way I read Scripture, I see him expressing himself over and over again. And so I'm trying to discern, okay, so what is that? What is the nature of that self-expression? What is that telling me about what healthy self-expression is like? And then what can I infer about that in terms of what unhealthy self-expression would look like. So I think there's going to be some kind of quality to an unhealthy self-expression. Actually, this ties into some of what I was saying a minute ago, that I think maybe is trying to help us avoid something, so I think what's interesting is that I don't think it's inherently or automatically bad that, if I'm self-expressing as an artist, and partly out of that I want to be known, because I think God wants to be known. And so I think wanting to be known isn't automatically, be like, oh, this is unhealthy self-expression. But I do think there can be a quality to how we're going about that can take on either a demandingness, like I'm going to make the world see me. So I think in terms of art, like going for a shock value, this is sort of an easy example. And so what's driving that choice isn't, hey, I'm trying to tell the truth about life in some kind of way, but instead, I'm going to make the world notice. And it's essentially the supervillain choice of the artist. I will make them see. That's fun with the microphone. So I think there's probably some other qualities to tease out there too, but I would be kind of, asking myself, like, what's driving this? Like, is this a way that I'm trying to bring some, tell some truth about something? Or am I trying to force something? Am I trying to avoid feeling, if I'm trying to force something, then I'm trying to avoid feeling something. I'm trying to avoid feeling small, feeling unloved, feeling not enough, feeling not respected, not valued. And those are all feelings, those are all experiences inside of me that, like, Christ wants me to learn to be present to, because he's present to them. He's actually already there. He's waiting for me to show up so that together we can bring healing to that. Right. So yeah, that would be some initial thoughts. I think there's a lot more to tease out there, but that hopefully gives you something to start with.
Thank you.
Is this Michael? Okay, good. Just to piggyback on that for just very brief, I think we touched on that a little bit last night too when Vesper said that not all things that you make should be shown. So there's a difference between self-expression that exists for you, between you and God, and self-expression that exists as a social engagement or as a communal engagement. I'm not sure how I feel about what I'm about to say, but I'm trying to think of limits within my own self-expression that's just with me and God, if there are any limits, and I'm not sure if there's any limits. Some of the most healthy things that I've ever said to God are things like, I hate you, God. Sometimes that is the healthiest, most honest thing that you could possibly say. Saying anything contrary would be an irreverence. And so, where that might be true with me and God, it might not be the best thing for me to be shouting from the rooftops. Right. Yeah, So I think there are communal aspects to what we bring to the table as far as our creative work, and there are definitely acts that are necessary in isolation. Maybe isolation is not the right word, in solitude. Okay. Well, y'all are awesome. I think we're gonna. Thanks, man. This one's fine. Y'all doing good? Did y'all enjoy this morning? I think it's been really good. Continue conversations with one another. Come up and talk to Sean. Come up and talk to Scott. Come up and talk to Ellen and Abby. Some of the best friendships that I have right now are people that I met at events like this that I've just stayed connected to, and so I want to encourage that. You guys are free to go. Check out the restaurant list on the sheet. If you want to go grab some food, go check out Penland. If you want to do that, go up to the mountains. We're not coming back here until doors open at 6 o'clock. So you got a good chunk of time to to refresh yourselves and all that good stuff. Thank you all so much. We'll see you in a bit. And thank you, Sean. My goodness, thank you so much, man. So much.